The wind had a lonely sound on the prairie, the kind that crept beneath doors and pressed against windowpanes like a restless ghost, and Margaret Hale had grown used to it in the 3 years since her husband was laid beneath the cottonwood tree on the hill. The ranch had once been alive with laughter and cattle calls and the steady rhythm of two hearts working side by side, but now it was only her boots on the porch at dawn and her lantern glowing late into the night. The townsfolk whispered about her stubbornness, about how no woman should try to run a spread that size alone, but Margaret wore her grief like a second skin and answered to no one. She fixed fences with blistered hands, bartered calves at market, and kept a shotgun by the door, not because she was fearless, but because fear had already taken the worst from her. So when the stranger rode in at sunset, casting a long shadow that seemed stitched to the horizon itself, she did not shrink back, she squared her shoulders and waited. He was the biggest man she had ever seen, broad as a barn door, with a dust-worn hat and a quiet gaze that seemed to measure everything without judgment. His horse snorted as he reined in, and for a long moment they simply studied one another, two solitary souls shaped by the same unforgiving land. Then he swung down from the saddle with surprising grace and said in a low, steady voice, "Ma'am, I hear you could use a hand." Margaret lifted her chin. "I didn't send for one." A flicker of something, amusement, maybe, touched his mouth. "No, but trouble don't wait for invitations." He introduced himself as Caleb Turner, a drifter by necessity rather than choice, a man who worked ranches from Texas to Montana and never stayed long enough for roots to grow. She noticed the way he handled his reins gently, the way his eyes scanned the sagging fence line without criticism, and she felt an unwelcome spark of hope she tried quickly to bury. "You've never met a man my size," he said quietly, almost teasing, though there was steel in his tone. "Let me show you how it's done." It wasn't arrogance that made her pause, it was certainty. Margaret had seen plenty of men boast and fail, but something about Caleb's steadiness unsettled her more than swagger ever could. She should have sent him away. Pride told her she didn't need him, fear told her she shouldn't trust him. But winter was approaching fast, and the north pasture fence had nearly collapsed. After a long silence, she stepped aside. "1 week," she said. "That's all." Caleb nodded once, as if that was more than he'd expected, and set to work before the sun had fully dipped behind the hills. In the days that followed, the ranch changed rhythm. Where Margaret had once strained alone to lift feed sacks, Caleb hoisted them as if they were flour bags. Where broken posts had leaned like tired soldiers, he reset them deep and firm. Yet he never overstepped. He asked before moving tools, listened before speaking, and treated her not as a widow in need of rescue but as a partner in labor. The townsfolk noticed. They watched from the general store porch, muttering predictions of scandal or heartbreak, but Margaret ignored them. What unsettled her wasn't gossip, it was the unfamiliar warmth creeping back into her chest when Caleb's deep laugh rolled across the yard or when he handed her a tin cup of coffee before dawn without being asked. One evening, as a storm brewed low and mean in the sky, a section of cattle broke through the far fence. Margaret reached for her coat, but Caleb was already saddling up. "It's too dark," she protested. "You'll lose them." He looked at her steadily. "Not tonight." She rode with him despite his protest, wind slashing at their faces as thunder cracked open the heavens. Side by side they chased the scattered herd through mud and lightning, shouting above the roar, and in that chaos something shifted, an understanding forged in shared risk. When they finally guided the last calf back through the gate, soaked and breathless, Margaret found herself laughing for the first time in years. Caleb studied her in the lantern glow, rain dripping from his hat brim. "You carry more than most men I've known," he said softly. She swallowed. "Carrying's all I've got left." He stepped closer, not touching, but near enough that she felt the steady heat of him. "Maybe it don't have to be." And for the first time since her husband's passing, Margaret wondered if survival was the only thing life had to offer.